Hello, thank you for joining us today. My name is Peggy Yee. I am the Managing Director of Global Food and Agriculture at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. For the past few years, we have been working together with the Forum on the Future of Agriculture as international partners to advance food system transformations. Last year, we had a robust discussion on strengthening transatlantic cooperation for research and innovation in the agri-food system. This past November, the Forum provided a platform to launch the collaboration platform between the European Commission's Directorate General for Agriculture and Rural Development and the US Department of Agriculture. This platform has provided a transatlantic dimension to many of our thematic focus areas and themes and activities, particularly with respect to regenerative agriculture, carbon farming, research, innovation and technology, and natural capital accounting. As part of the Forum's 2022 Month of March program, organized around the theme of striving for food system transformation, today's fireside chat will continue this focus on the value of transatlantic collaboration to increase the resilience and sustainability of the global agri-food system. Today, we bring together a former European Commission for Environment and Research and a former US Secretary of Agriculture to reflect on the outcomes of the UN Food System Summit and COP26, and to share their perspectives on where we are, what needs to happen to increase resilience and sustainability, while ensuring that the food and agriculture sectors make their contribution to mitigate climate change and improve health and nutrition. I'm excited for what I know will be a thought-provoking fireside chat. Here to introduce our honorable guests is my esteemed colleague, Mark Titterington, who serves as a senior advisor to the Forum on the Future of Agriculture and a senior fellow at the Transatlantic Policy Network. Mark.
Peggy, thank you very much indeed, and a great pleasure to be working with the Chicago Council once again, and a real honor and pleasure to welcome back former US Agriculture Secretary Dan Glickman and former European Commissioner Yanis Potočnik. Great to have you both with us. I'm going to start with you, Mr. Secretary, if I may. A lot has happened in the last 12 months since we last spoke in this kind of a forum. In particular, we've had COP26, we've had the UN Food System Summit. I'd just be interested in what your general reflections are on the outcome of those meetings and indeed others, and in particular as they might relate to the food and agriculture system.
Well, thank you very much, Mark and Yanis. It's a pleasure to join you, and thanks again for the Chicago Council's engagement in all this. First of all, I have to mention that we're in this midst of a crisis that our world has not seen for years and years, and Yanis is a lot closer to it than I certainly am. And you know, it's like there's a lot of craziness in this world right now, and let's pray and hope that we get ourselves out of that. The people of Ukraine can come back home. And one nice thing is the rest of the world has seemed to come together in opposition to what has happened in Ukraine. So I just thought I needed to mention that because it was on President Biden's State of the Union message, his leadership, and it again shows the importance of the transatlantic dialogue generally, because that dialogue has produced a collaboration that we have not seen for years and years and years. So given that, let me move to your more specific question, if I can. And I'd say that both the Food Summit and COP26 were great starts to discussing much more serious commitments to agriculture, the food sector. You know, the trick will be, can we execute on those great commitments? I mean, there's a lot of good stuff going on. Will the various countries and will the private sector and will the farming sector move ahead and doing the kinds of things that we need to do? The energy sector has always kind of been in the middle of this whole issue of climate and sustainability. And it's really a positive thing to see the agriculture sector be included in the discussion with respect to solutions. The Food Summit itself, the US government came up with a multi-billion-dollar commitment and overall investment related to food and agriculture. Secretary Vilsack was there to do that. So I think, by and large, I'm optimistic. I think we're in the game, so to speak. The trick is, will we be able to execute on that?
I'll come back to you in a moment, Mr. Secretary, if I may, on the optimism versus maybe some concerns that might be coming out of that. Before I do that, let me turn to you, Yanis Potočnik. I mean, you are very closely involved in the UN framework around these meetings. I know you've been involved in some this week. What's your perspective on what we heard from COP26, UN Food Systems Summit, and some of the other things that you've been involved in?
Thank you, Mark. And Dan, it's great to have this dialogue with you. I'm a bit more critical about the developments. I will explain you why. I think it's an important step forward, but bit too little and too late. And why I do consider it might take a bit longer than your explanation. I see the climate talks are mainly addressing today, and this is not only Glasgow, it's basically climate talks, the supply side problems. So it's focusing on providing the clean energy, optimizing, greening, cleaning the current economic model, which I think will unfortunately not be enough to meet the 1.5 degree target. So current efforts are to an important extent, I think, ignoring the need for a deeper system change transformation, which would address also the overconsumption in high-income countries and reasons for the fact that we are already overshooting the planetary boundaries practically in many areas. So this is leading to also to the lasting tensions between the high-income countries and low-income countries. And you have seen that low-income countries are pretty much focusing on the financial support. And since we are not really addressing the drivers and pressures which are leading to the situation, I can already predict that their focus on higher financial needs, and rightly so, will be in the future even bigger. So it's also a kind of energy climate bubble where ministers for agriculture, industry, transport, trade, social matters, I don't know, finance, do not really participate, and policy options in their disposal are not considered as part of the solutions. While energy is definitely the most important part, solutions related to demand side, so decoupling of well-being from natural resource use and environmental impacts are really not taken into account. So we have seen just these days, Ukraine, which you mentioned already, in the crisis and terrible war there, how fragile and insecure solutions are when we are betting only on the supply side. So, and I think that we need simply to decouple the function of mobility, of housing, of nutrition, or if you want, well-being overall from virgin resource use and environmental impacts. However, if we look to the country's current nationally determined contributions and national climate plans, we can see that this systemic approach, despite efforts by many, is still to a large extent missing. Of course, we could find also quite some positives, big pledges in cutting methane emissions, deforestation, basic rules governing carbon markets, and an increase in funding for climate adaptation in developing countries. Important pledge to phase down coal with unfortunate wording, to be honest, phase out of inefficient fossil fuel subsidies, basically recognizing that some fossil fuel subsidies are efficient. Nature and forests were finally quite seriously on the agenda, but again, not really accompanied with a clear financial commitment. So the main problem which I see is that we are running quickly out of the road to deliver on the action that it's needed to avert a climate catastrophe. And I think that that creates both cause of concern and a need to inject urgency in the future climate planning. Few words just on the food summit. One thing which I found really positive there is that which marked it different comparing to other UN events, that it was really focusing on the driver of environmental crisis and not only on the outcome, like climate change, biodiversity loss. So it's really encouraging to see that UN is finally moving in this direction. And I hope the signals of willingness to expand and strengthen future actions on drivers is something which is really positive, and we can bet that this will even more happen in the future. So we have seen from the work, I'm currently co-chairing the International Resource Panel of United Nations, and we see from the trends of material use, which basically comprise everything what is extracted from the earth, that that this has tripled from 1970, and if we do not change our behavior, it will double again till 2060. So therefore, it is absolutely necessary to decouple growth in well-being and prosperity from natural resource use and its impacts. What we really need are systemic interventions which would limit the need for energy and resources in the first place. So on the top of decarbonization, which we all talk about, we need also a kind of decommodification, or if you want, dematerialization of the systems on which we depend. Simply, we need to reject the assumption that these systems need to be resource intensive. So addressing the drivers, reasons for triple planetary crisis would provide solutions which would simultaneously lead to positive developments, addressing all the challenges we face at the same time. That, for me, it's a really important message of hope, because it's possible if only we address the right questions. So on the positive side of Food System Summit, I should mention that many companies committed to the private sector pledge to zero hunger to meet SDG goal number 2. Signing of business declaration on food system transformation, it's also a welcome step in the right direction. Getting alignment of so many global executives with the ability and capacity to deliver impactful change, it's an important step. But as with the COP26, there are questions about whether is it enough. So some have argued that more teeth are required in 3 key areas. First, meaningful commitments which enable accountability for business. Second, clear action plans for improvement, which align with existing international standards and reflect what companies can do to drive the change. And third, good corporate governance, avoiding undue influence over public institutions and allowing them to play their role in food system transformation. Nevertheless, I think that we need to recognize that a positive platform was created, potentially important for the urgency to push the action, the delivery on the words spoken there, but also elsewhere.
Yanis and Dan, thank you very much for those opening thoughts. I want to take what you both said in terms of the positives. You know, Yanis, you highlighted a couple of things that were coming out of COP26 and UN Food Systems Summit. You know, Dan, you talked about almost the convening power, the fact that people were coming together. As you look forward over the next 12 to 18 months and beyond, I mean, specifically in this area of climate and food and agriculture system transformation, Yanis, first to you, how optimistic are you that we can make the progress that has perhaps been established by the foundation that's been created over the last 12 months?
Mark, if I would start with IPBES 2019 assessment, which is basically saying that only 4 of nature contributions to people ecosystem services are increasing, and all are provisioning ecosystem services. In other words, what we harvest from biosphere, food, timber, and other materials. The huge expansion in delivery of provisioning ecosystem services, it's coming at the expense of often silent and invisible ecosystem services, which maintain our stable environment and contribute to quality of life. But there are certainly quite a lot of reasons also for hope for me, because there are approaches which balance delivery of provisioning systems and regulating services simultaneously. We can, for example, change the balance of crops produced for food and animal feed, tipping it in favor of food for direct human consumption. We can upscale systems like agroforestry, which provide food and other ecosystem services like carbon sequestration. At the same time, also marine production systems can also deliver multiple benefits. Aquaculture to produce, for example, seaweed and bivalves, it's a great option because these species absorb nutrients directly from their environment. They do not depend on feedstocks. This kind of aquaculture improves seawater clarity and also quality, and creates habitat for nearby fisheries. Amazing agriculture technologies are also a cause for hope, like precision farming, vertical farming, also the production of meat analogs. they can indeed rely on expensive machinery, but we can see that this technology is being offered to farmers through dematerialized product as service business models, which is again very encouraging. In short, the emergence of these new business models in food system, which seek to create new additional value through sustainability solution, through shared, throughout shared in the food chain, it's really welcomed. Also, behavioral change is being incentivized. For example, supermarkets are making sustainable dietary choices cheaper and easier to access. Of course, we always need to do more also when price signals are connected with the planetary interest. What we should understand is, I think that for the first time in the human history, we face the emergence of this single tightly coupled human socio-ecological scope of, system of planetary scope. So we are more interconnected and interdependent than ever, which means that we need better cooperation, sharing sovereignty, and also fixing the governance models. And both, which you mentioned, COP26 and UNFSS, have actually shown their convening power and also ability to arguably create this unprecedented alignment on the action and need to be taken by government and businesses. And the COVID pandemic also taught us two important lessons. The world can come together to take coordinated action in face of these extreme events, and also that the food and agricultural system could proved itself to be remarkably resilient, at least particularly in the early stages. Finally, I think also that, that we see emerging also alignment around one important concept, which we call regenerative agriculture. We would all agree that there is much work to be done concerning definitions, practices, engagement, incentives to growers, and so on. But it's very encouraging to see the challenge being taken by many companies, growers embracing and innovating for change, also governments and academia research, exploring tangible ways it can be supported. So there is much to be positive about, but the companies and institutions are asking the right questions now and more thinking about the whole system than in the past. So the open question really remains whether change can be delivered quickly enough and at scale to meet the climate and sustainability challenges we face.
Yanis, thank you. So I come to you, if I may now, Mr. Secretary. I mean, Yanis has talked about innovation, he's talked about technology, he's talked about convening power. You know, you of course sat on top at a political level of a food and agriculture system that is highly developed, highly technified in the United States, Secretary Glickman. Is that where your source of optimism comes from, that we can rise to the challenge that now confronts us in the coming months and years ahead?
Well, first of all, Yanis is a great teacher. I'd love to take a course from him because I learned a lot from what he said, and I agree with most of it. But I'm going to probably veer off a little bit from the questions because he raised so many issues. But you know, there are two quotes I'd like to use. One is from Napoleon, who said, "War is too important to be left to the generals, and these issues are too important to be left to one segment of the world. So it's too important just to be left to the farmers, too important just to be left to agriculture, too important to be just left to our political establishment, too important to just to be left to our private sector. This is something that requires mandates collaboration. And the second thing is, I think it was John Maynard Keynes, a British economist, who said, for every complicated problem, there is a simple and a wrong solution. And so I'm thinking to myself, I don't know what the wrong solution is, but this is sure a hell of a complicated problem. How we're going to deal with these multitude of issues that Yanis just raised that require collaboration. And the third thing I'd say is progress in agriculture globally has always been historically slow. Agriculture is very conservative. Farmers are very conservative. The risks involved with weather and the markets. And just look what's happening in Ukraine and Russia now with the grain markets and everything. The risks are so great that farmers are just they worry about taking big risks because they don't know if there'll ever be a return if they take those risks. And notwithstanding the horrendous nature of the climate problem, the progress is slow. And yet you have to get agriculture buy-in. There has to be buy-in from farmers and agriculture leaders worldwide to get any progress on any of these issues. And that's global agriculture cooperation. So the U.S., the U.S. has not always been the best leader in the world on these issues, but in the recent administrations, and particularly Secretary Vilsack and the Biden administration, they did make a lot of commitments as a result of COP26, as a result of the World UN Food Summit, and a result of domestic politics. So now you have billions of dollars going into climate-related things involving agriculture, but it can't just be agriculture. It's got to be agriculture and energy. It's got to be food consumption. The consumer is a huge factor in all this. If the consumer doesn't go along with what you're trying to do, then you're in deep trouble. I would just mention a couple of things. Number one is the U.S. is about ready to redo its farm programs, and there will be a huge climate and sustainability component to those farm programs. Billions and billions of dollars will be spent. And let's hope that these issues that Yanis brought up will be part of that discussion. I know that's on the top agenda of the Biden administration right now. And the second issue is science. So as you deal with the issues that Yanis talked about, and they go all the way from water utilization, reduction of carbon, pests, drought, water, a whole variety of things. If the world isn't actively putting resources and people power into the science of agriculture, for example, how do you use less water to produce more plants and animal product? What are issues involving desalination, photosynthesis? How do crops grow faster using less inputs? How do we reduce the amount of inputs that are going into agriculture? How do you have animals that produce less methane? So we can talk about these problems conceptually from a macro perspective, but where the rubber hits the road is where a lot of the answers will come from. So that means the global scientific community has to have the resources to study all of these issues. That means dollars, it means euros, it means training people out there to do the kinds of things that are going to be doing. So you need the policy, and that's where I think COP and the Food Summit is encouraging. But you got to look down the road and figure out how you're going to solve these problems, and how you're going to solve them so an average producer is accepting of what's going on and with the risks involved, and how they get compensated in that process. So as somebody who kind of was in the nitty-gritty politics of agriculture and food as a member of Congress for all these years, I know that not a lot gets done if farmers and ranchers and to some extent consumers aren't in the action in the early part of the thing. It all can't come from governments. Governments can provide leadership and resources, but ultimately it's a ground up exercise to see whether people will actually solve these problems or not.
So if I may, Mr. Secretary, I'd like to just explore the two areas that I'm going to characterize as concerns, but I put back to you as questions, really. You talked about the need to get farmers and ranchers into the game to get their buy-in. You also mentioned consumers as well. So with your long experience, I'm going to really put you on the spot here. How do we do that?
Well, good question. Is there somebody else in the room that can answer these questions? Okay, so let's talk first about consumers, because the power of consumers is immense. And if a consumer wants to buy certain products, whether they have certain qualities to them, organic, whether they want to buy sustainable products, whether they want to buy products where labor is treated more fairly, they have this immense power over the supply chain network to change the behavior of the producers of food. And you're seeing more of that now. More and more consumers are demanding sustainable products, and more consumers are demanding that agriculture get in the game, so to speak. But that's something that the governments can't do all that much about to inspire. It really has to come from the ground up, and other institutions, the nonprofit community, the NGO community, and they're pretty active, but they just need to get more active. And then when they get active, then companies like Walmart, for example, which is the largest food retailer in the world, and others respond. And they start saying, Walmart might saying, we're not going to carry this product unless it has a sustainability label on it, or unless there's some quality to it that helps the environment. So that's the consumer side of the picture. The farmer side and the agriculture side is much more complex because of the way governments support agriculture. I mean, the US and Europe are just gigantic supporters of various subsidies involving agriculture and have been for generations. It's kind of part of the ethic of producing agriculture. So how can you change the incentives for farmers to grow crops and raise animals in a different way than they're doing now? Now, most farmers are beginning to understand that weather and climate is impacting them. The freeze zones are moving further and further north. The heat is going up. The water utilization is changing. And more farmers are concerned about crop inputs, pesticides, fertilizers, insecticides, all that kind of stuff that's on there. But for them to take action requires government policy that provides compensation for them in some way, and also make sure that they have some control over their own lives. So for example, and I'll quit real quick, I met with a group of farmers fairly recently and said, you know, we know that carbon is a real problem. We'd like to become much more active in reducing carbon emissions and maybe getting involved in the global carbon markets. How do we do it? All the politicians talk this great game about carbon control, but how does it actually implement at the ground level? So we know if we spend tens of thousands of dollars or euros doing program X, we're able to get some money back in the process, or we're able to provide resources in the process. And so those are things that the policymakers really have to think of as they're getting down and dirty and figuring out how to actually solve the problems.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Yanis, I'm going to invite you also to build, if you'd like to, on what Dan has said. When we were talking earlier, you also pointing to concerns that you have about the urgency of action that we've got. I think you talked about COP26, your reflection being too little, too late. Could you just elaborate on the extent of that concern and what you think needs to happen to increase the urgency and the pace of action, whether that's from government side or indeed from the private sector?
We'll come to that at the end, but just maybe to build on something which Dan was saying, and he's absolutely right, that about the complexity, and that there are indeed no simple solutions. But for me, what is, being an economist, by the way, what is the major concern is that contemporary economics, it's considering humans external to nature and not part of nature. So I think for the beginning, what we should all together answer is, do we agree that we are part of nature too? Because if we would agree that we are part of nature too, we would in many ways act differently. And then it comes a lot to the question which is related to market economy. So it looks like that market as a kind of distributive mechanism, it's here to stay also in the future. And you know, according to economic theory, consumers and producers on the markets behave rationally, even if those days rationality of humans, it's a bit questioned. But due to the signals which we are receiving as producers and consumers, which means we do not actually value nature, this rationality, it's only rationality in the short term, rationality for us here and now, but it's not rational via future generations. It's not rational via other living beings and on this planet. So what we should at minimum do, and where we should esteem, is to align short-term market incentives with long-term public well-being needs and also regulation. In the current situation, we are in a way, if I would say so, rowing against the flow of the river, because on one hand you have regulation and also active engagements of many which are following the public interest. But on the other hand, you have market signals which are actually sending us just in the opposite direction. So efforts should certainly be focusing on fixing these market signals, prices, taxes, subsidies, and so on. But we see how difficult this approach actually in practice is. And the reasons are manifold, from existing lock-ins to social unacceptance. But most important, it's probably that all of us producers and consumers simply got used not valuing nature and not paying the cost and price for that. And now changing that, it's a hell of a job. So I think this is a truly important message also for the needed food system transformation, since it is clear that food should be accessible to all. And it's not reasonable to accept that the costs of nature depletion would be integrated in the food costs and prices without making societies fairer, more equal, and without addressing at the same time also the income distribution and socially related questions. So for me, environmental and social transition are just two sides of the same coin, and of the sustainability efforts. So complementarity and in a way alternative approach, it's a bit when you look to the so-called circular economy solutions, if you understand circular economy in a broader way, in different kind of extended producer responsibility, everything as a service, where we rather where we actually change the incentives in a way that something which is currently the profit base for producers would become actually its cost, and this would give us the same kind of effects like the market incentives. So but in one sentence to conclude, we need government leadership, but at the end we need the ownership and trust among all actors. And it's essential that all of us tries to understand the other, step in other shoes, understand the transitional needs, and evolve in that discussion and search of solutions.
All right. Well, I mean, both of you have held very senior leadership positions at the top of the European institutions, the U.S. federal government, Mr. Secretary, your congressional work. You've both sat on the top of these enormously powerful blocs, the United States and the European Union. How important then is it for these two sides to work together, not just at government level, but to create the conditions where the private sector companies, the universities and the research establishment, the civil society interactions that we have, how important is that collaboration between the two to drive the change, both domestically and indeed globally? Yanis, I'm going to start with you on that.
Yeah, Mark, just to repeat what you said, I think we need to understand that the responsibility which is behind the fact that we are two of the biggest political, civil, and also economic blocs in the world. And as we are currently seeing, our unity and leadership has the potential to drive the real change and also the progress. We have been reminded by recent developments how fragile and insecure we basically are. But we have also been reminded how quickly we forget how fragile and insecure we are and focus only on our own short-term interests and profits. So I think we should be focusing our collaboration on creating alternatives to fossil fuels, minerals, both by reducing demand side and by ramping up alternative sources of supply. We should be taking the SDGs and Paris Agreement as points of alignment, spend more time building shared vision, action to measure and decarbonize emissions, decouple well-being from natural resources, environmental impacts, rather than sometimes debating the smaller areas of disagreement. Also in the agricultural area, too often in the past, I think we have focused on what divides us without ignoring those challenges. I think we need to look at what unites us and where we can work together to transform the food and agricultural system. And I'm encouraged both by the Transatlantic Collaboration Platform on agriculture established by Secretary Wilczek and Commissioner Wojciechowski last November, as well also about the steps in the right direction, which were already mentioned by then, new climate smart commodities initiative announced by the Secretary Wilczek in US. So I think this is pretty much similar to what we see in EU initiatives around farm to fork, soil health, sustainable carbon cycles. Collectively, there is much to work on here together. None of these initiatives are complete or final. They should be seen as evolving organically, albeit with urgency, and we should achieve this transatlantic understanding, alignment, the ability for these two blocks to drive the real systemic change could be really unprecedented. But to be successful, I think that both sides will need to rise above past battles on trade, which have often hampered our relationship, and recognize that this might be easier said than done, I know. But on the other hand, also with great companies on both sides, with great universities on both sides, with great research established on both sides, our civil society actors, within the political commitments which are clearly emerging recently, I think there is a lot of promising which we can do together.
Thank you, Yanis. Mr. Secretary, your perspective on the transatlantic collaboration generally and also in this area, has it been renewed?
Well, first of all, I agree with virtually everything Yanis has said. And I say virtually because I actually agree with everything he said, but there must be something in there I disagree with. So I had to say that. But, you know, I'm reminded, I like to use quotes from previous folks who've been in either economics or political government, but Mark Twain, the American humorist, once said that America has two of the greatest friends in the world. They are the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans. And, you know, but those days are gone as a result of COVID and potential nuclear war in Central Europe and the whole climate thing. We are globally interconnected, and that's not just true from the abstract point of view. It's first of all, you get on an airplane and you can transfer diseases all over the world, and trade and crops have to move from place to place, and we need each other desperately. But most of our companies now are global, and in the private sector, at least larger companies. I'm amazed at the number of American companies that are headquartered in Europe. And so everything that Yanis said in terms of building these relationships, working together academically and politically, it can't be done without that. I mean, the U.S. can do something on its own, but if it's not transferred to Europe or vice versa, you know, nothing will happen. The second thing is trust. You know, what I find is one of the inhibitions to doing what we're trying to do is getting people together is this trust deficit that exists in the world today between people and their governments. And you see this with COVID, particularly in the United States, people resisting vaccines and masks and all this kind of thing. But it's true all over the world, people not trusting their governments. And so it's kind of hard to get governments together to do things if people themselves don't trust what the governments are saying, or they don't think that they're necessarily on the level. And so I mentioned that there's not much we can do about that, except politicians just need to do a better job of being honest and also working collaboratively with other sectors of the economy and the world. But at least with respect to the North Atlantic Alliance and Europe and the United States, there's such a profound history. And, you know, I don't want to keep mentioning Ukraine, but look what happened with NATO after our previous president talked about maybe getting out of NATO. And then all of a sudden we have a crisis of incredible proportions, and we see how important and critical collaboration is. And we just have to get sustainability and climate to a level, it may not get to the level of nuclear war. Let's hope we don't have that issue, but it has to get to a much higher level than it's gotten before. And at least now we're talking about these issues. And, agriculture and food were never brought up in previous meetings involving the geopolitical meetings that happen in the world, the G7, the G20, and now they are. So that's a possible thing. And there is this third thing is that I once heard a man speak. He said, just because you can't do everything doesn't mean you can't do something. And so that's another thing. We're not going to each be able to change the world overnight, but piece by piece, we can probably incrementally do the things that need to be done. It may not be as fast as what some would like, but that's just the way the world is. It's a decentralized world. And I'm going to add one other point, which I mentioned before, and that is science. Okay, so this is a complicated issue because many of the issues we're talking about can be solved, or the solutions can be made by science. And there's a lot of skepticism in some quarters about some science. In Europe, there's great skepticism about GMOs. In the United States, there's great skepticism about some of the science that's coming out of Europe with respect to production of crops. But what I saw with this RNA vaccines with the COVID is that it was miraculous. They were able to produce vaccines that actually did a heck of a job of stopping this illness and stopping people from getting killed. And the reason why that happened is years and years of science, collaborative science globally. It was in Germany, it was in China, and it was in the US, and that science was shared, and it can make a difference. Can we use science as a way to move the world forward? It can't just be alone. It's got to be with government policy and a lot of the things that Yanis just talked about. And there's a lot of conflict on science. For example, what if we could use genetic engineering to produce crops that use 10% of the water that they're using right now, or 25% of the water, but it involves genetic engineering, which is very suspicious in various parts of the world. Is that something that we shouldn't, pursue or not? And how we get people to trust that kind of those new technologies. So there's I could talk forever that I want to mention one final thing, and that's China. So I don't think you can talk about any of these issues without talking about China. They have about 35% of the world's population. Their consumers are demanding more protein, and their environmental and sustainability record is not very good, particularly in the energy area with respect to coal. But they also are beginning to recognize that they can't have those blackout days in Beijing anymore where you can't see across the street because of the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So I don't think we can really do much in this area without engaging and involving China as well.
I mean, thank you both for taking us through your particular thoughts there on the transatlantic relationship, where it can add value, but also perhaps an honest reflection of some of the things that might get in the way. Listening to you both, I'm tempted to reflect more on the fact that we're coming to a point where we have to ask the question what our world looks like if the United States and the European Union don't collaborate together, not just in this area, but in all the areas that we've touched on in this conversation, and indeed in others. I'm conscious of taking more of your time than would be necessary or appropriate. So I'm going to bring us to a conclusion here and ask both of you, and I'll start with you, Yanis. As you look at the year ahead, we've got the run up to COP27 and the things that will come around that and after it. I'm really going to push you for one thing that you think needs to happen that will enable us to at least move forward on our goals of achieving a more resilient, even more resilient and sustainable food and agriculture system. So you're on the spot, Yanis.
Yeah, thanks. In 1 minute. First, on general, and then on agriculture. On general, I think we need to ensure that national climate action plans are actually delivering the progress we need individually and collectively. So we should implement solutions which focus on making the whole value chains nature positive. And I would certainly also call for a better integration of supply, demand, and nature-based solutions to deliver the full potential of the existing options to fight against the climate change. but on the food and agriculture specifically, maybe develop a framework which provides us with a mechanism for common accounting for the externalities and bringing consumption production into balance, and create conditions for scaling up regenerative agriculture, and maybe also to change biofuels mandates to direct more grain to feeding people rather than feeding the cars. And just one final remark, which is valid for general as well for food-related efforts. Immediate solutions are, of course, urgently needed, but we should not be distracted by low-hanging fruits. Actually, actions always need to be aligned with needed long-term systemic perspective and changes.
Yanis, thank you very much. Mr. Secretary?
Well, I noticed
One or
Giannis
more
just
thing.
he didn't do just one thing, so I may find it difficult to do just one thing. But I for most of the things he talked about are right on. You know, and not just looking at low-hanging fruit in the next 12 months, but you got to be looking much more down the future. I just say a couple of things, a little parochial here. The U.S. Farm Bill is coming up in the next couple of years. It will have a lot to do what the U.S. is going to do itself over the next decade. And I'm sure that the EU agricultural policy is the same way, but we are going to have this farm bill. It's going to be a $100 billion bill, maybe bigger than that. A big chunk of it's going to be in climate smart agriculture. And that bill needs to address some of these issues globally as well. The second thing is building trust among the players. So that farmers don't feel that things are being done to them, that they're participating in this decision-making network. They're going to demand it anyway, whether we want them or not. And that's European farmers and American farmers who are both very independent, very entrepreneurial, but very resilient to the extent possible. So building trust among the players. And the third is not only the U.S. Transatlantic Alliance, but we've got to also recognize that that there are many other country players. China is one, the Middle East players, the UAE, Israel, others who are doing great work in this area. Sub-Saharan Africa, the 5 of the 10 fastest growing countries in the world are in Sub-Saharan Africa. Where do they play in these issues where their farmers have virtually no resources to do the kinds of things that European and American farmers in agriculture do, and how we collaborate with them? I don't mean to overcomplexify it, Mark, because it is an awfully complicated problem, but those are things I would add to what Giannis has said.
Well, both of you, thank you very much indeed. We're very fortunate. I feel honored. I asked for one thing, and I think between you, you gave me 8 or 9 things, which is terrific. You're both so generous with your time and thinking. You are both great teachers in terms of the wealth of experience that you have, and it's just been a pleasure to be talking to you both. So, former Commissioner, European Commissioner for Environment and Research, Yanis Potočnik, former Secretary of Agriculture in the United States, Dan Glickman, thank you very much indeed for taking time to talk to us, and I'll pass it back to Peggy.
Thank you, Mark, for being a terrific moderator today, and it's been terrific being able to hear these enormous and wonderful insights from both Commissioner Potočnik and Secretary Glickman. And I just wanted to offer some closing remarks related to what I've heard as and being able to highlight what we've talked about transatlantic cooperation and how we move forward. So as Commissioner Yanis Potočnik mentioned, food is necessary for all, and the US and EU have a great responsibilities as 2 of the largest political and economic blocs in the world. And we need to focus on what unites us than what divides us in moving forward in these important discussions. Climate talks are not only are only addressing the issues today related to energy, and yet have to focus on the food system for not just today, but for the future. And thus we need systemic interventions to address deeper systems changes for tomorrow, including high income consumption and environmental impacts, and issues related to incentives and financial commitments to fix these market issues to avert a climate catastrophe. We need government leadership, but we also need trust and involvement from everyone. In the near future, we'll need to develop a framework for accounting for externalities, changing biofuel mandates, and addressing long-term system changes. We are globally interconnected and more dependent than ever. And as the pandemic has demonstrated, we can come together. As Secretary Dan Glickman noted, these multitude of issues and their complexity are too important to just be left to one group and requires mandated cooperation. Progress in agriculture has historically been slow as farmers are conservatives and more risk averse, yet you have to get agriculture buy-in. Consumers have immense purchase power to change the behaviors of producers of food with increasing demand for sustainable products. With the upcoming Farm Bill, Secretary Glickman hopes that these issues will be top of the agenda with the Biden administration. We will need to actively put resources into the science of agriculture to move the world forward. As a global scientific community, we'll need to have the resources and human capacity to study and tackle these issues. But it will ultimately be an effort that will need to happen from the ground up for buy-in and implementation. There's this trust deficit between citizens and their governments. And while governments can collaborate, there's this challenge that we'll need to recognize in building goodwill and trust among all players locally and globally, including in China and the UAE. As Commissioner Potocnik mentioned, we are all part of nature, and we agree on that. And we will all play a critical role, piece by piece, in transforming our global food and agricultural system to address critical challenges in sustainability and resilience. I hope the dialogue today has not only informed, but inspired you in looking forward to the discussions at COP27 and other fora on how the EU and US can collaborate in forging a better future together. So we invite you to continue tuning into the forum's events next week for Loose Solutions events and in 2 weeks for policy events. On behalf of the Chicago Council of Global Affairs, we want to thank the forum for being terrific international partners as we work together to advance a more sustainable and resilient global food system by addressing challenges facing our planet and the most vulnerable producers and consumers. As the Chicago Council celebrates our 100th anniversary this year, we hope you will continue joining us for this important work. Thank you again for joining us today. Have a great rest of the morning and afternoon.
Thanks.